The ocean has always been a place of mystery and danger, but in the medieval world, it was something far more, a stage for some of the most dramatic and decisive battles in history. Think of the waves not just as water, but as the backdrop for empires rising and falling, for fleets locked in combat, and for strategies so bold they defied the limits of the age. This was a time when control of the seas meant control of destiny, where a single battle could rewrite the map of power forever. From the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the sun-drenched waters of the Mediterranean, the medieval ocean was a war zone, and the ships that sailed it were instruments of conquest. Imagine the roar of the wind filling the sails of Viking longships as they descended upon unsuspecting coasts, or the rhythmic pounding of oars as Byzantine dromons clashed with Arab fleets in a struggle for dominance. These weren't just skirmishes, they were full-scale wars fought on the open water, where every maneuver could mean victory or annihilation. The stakes were unimaginably high, trade routes that fed entire nations, territories that spanned continents, and the very survival of kingdoms hung in the balance. And yet, these battles were more than just clashes of force. They were tests of ingenuity, where admirals outthought as much as outfought their enemies, using the sea itself as a weapon. So why do these battles still matter centuries later? Because they shaped the world we live in today. The outcomes determined who held power, who controlled wealth, and even how cultures mixed and ideas spread. The medieval naval wars were more than just fights, they were turning points in history, moments where the course of civilization could have gone in entirely different directions. In this video, we'll explore 20 of these epic confrontations, from the famous to the forgotten, each one a story of courage, cunning, and the relentless will to rule the waves. This is the untold saga of how the ocean became the ultimate medieval battlefield, and why its echoes still ripple through time. The Battle of Svalda in the year 1000 was more than just a fight between rival Viking kings. It was a showdown over who would rule the waves of the north. Picture this: King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, a warrior known for his daring and vision, stood against a formidable alliance of Danish and Swedish forces. His fleet, though smaller, was a marvel of Viking ingenuity, sleek longships designed for speed and maneuverability, each one a testament to his understanding of the sea as both battlefield and advantage. But his enemies had numbers on their side, their ships crowding the waters like a forest of masts. What unfolded wasn't just a clash of swords and shields, but a battle of wits, where Olaf's bold tactics met the brute force of a coalition determined to break Norway's growing power. The stakes couldn't have been higher: control of the Baltic trade routes, the loyalty of coastal villages, even the cultural identity of Scandinavia hung in the balance. Olaf's ships, with their high prows carved into snarling dragons, were built to intimidate as much as to outmaneuver. He used the sea itself as his ally, luring the enemy into narrow channels where his smaller fleet could pick them apart. Yet in the end, even brilliance couldn't overcome sheer numbers. Olaf's defeat reshaped the political map of the North, proving that in the Viking world, naval power wasn't just about strength. It was about strategy, innovation, and the ability to turn the ocean into a weapon. But why does this battle still echo through history? Because it reveals a truth about the medieval world. The sea was the ultimate proving ground. Viking kings didn't just fight for land, they fought for the right to sail, trade, and raid without challenge. The Battle of Svalda showed that even the mightiest rulers could fall if they lost command of the waves. And for the Vikings, that lesson was written in blood and salt water, a reminder that in their age, the ocean was never just water, it was the path to empire. Just a few centuries after the Viking Age, another naval battle would reshape the balance of power in Europe, but this time the key players were England and France. The Battle of Slies in the year 1340 wasn't just another clash of ships, it was the moment England proved it could dominate the seas, and in doing so, rewrite the rules of naval warfare. Picture the scene. King Edward Roman III, young and ambitious, faced a French fleet so vast its ships reportedly blocked the horizon. The French had the numbers, the experience, and the confidence that came from controlling the channel. But what they didn't count on was England's secret weapon, a simple, devastating innovation that would turn the tide of history. That weapon, the English longbow. These weren't just ordinary bows, they were tools of war so powerful they could pierce armor at staggering distances. And for the first time in naval combat, they were deployed from the decks of ships, transforming floating fortresses into platforms of precision destruction. As the French closed in, expecting a traditional boarding fight, they were met instead with a storm of arrows raining down from above. The result was chaos, ships colliding, men falling, and the once proud French fleet dissolving into disarray. Edward's victory wasn't just about strength, it was about reimagining how battles at sea could be fought, but the impact went far beyond that single day. Sluys marked the birth of England's naval identity, the moment it realized control of the waves could decide the fate of nations. With the French fleet shattered, England secured its grip on the Channel, ensuring safe passage for troops and trade during the 100 Years' War. More than that, it signaled a shift in strategy. Ships weren't just transport anymore, they were weapons in their own right. The lessons learned at Sluys would echo through the ages, shaping everything from the tactics of the Spanish Armada to the rise of the British Empire. What made this battle truly revolutionary, though, wasn't just the victory. It was the way it blurred the lines between land and sea. For centuries, naval battles had been about ramming, boarding, and close-quarters combat. But at Sluys, England showed that the best land tactics could be adapted to the water, turning the sea itself into an extension of the battlefield. It was a reminder that in war, innovation often matters more than tradition, and that sometimes the simplest ideas change history. The Mediterranean Sea had long been a crossroads of empires, but in the year 1571, it became the stage for one of the most monumental naval confrontations in history, the Battle of Lepanto. Though it unfolded just beyond the medieval era, this clash was deeply rooted in centuries of maritime tradition, pitting the fleets of the Holy League against the mighty Ottoman Empire in a struggle that would echo across continents. Picture the scene: over 400 ships crammed into the Gulf of Patras, their oars churning the water into froth, their decks bristling with soldiers and cannons. This wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a collision of worlds where faith, technology, and sheer willpower would decide the fate of the Mediterranean. What made Lepanto so extraordinary wasn't just its scale, it was the way it marked a turning point in how wars were fought at sea. The Ottoman fleet, a formidable force of galleys powered by banks of rowers, represented the old order, a system perfected over centuries of naval dominance. But the Holy League, a coalition of Catholic states led by Spain and Venice, brought something new to the fight, a mix of traditional galleys and the first glimpses of sail-powered warships, vessels that could harness the wind rather than rely on human muscle. This shift wasn't just tactical, it was revolutionary, hinting at the future of naval warfare where mobility and firepower would trump sheer numbers. The battle itself was a frenzy of chaos and courage. As the fleets closed in, the air filled with the thunder of cannons and the screams of men. The Holy League's flagship, the Real, became the heart of the fight, its decks a scene of hand-to-hand combat as soldiers clashed with scimitars and pikes. Yet amid the brutality, it was strategy that won the day. The League's commanders used their heavier guns to punch holes in the Ottoman lines, while their reserve forces waited to exploit the gaps. By sunset, the sea was strewn with wreckage, and the Ottomans had suffered a defeat so staggering it shattered their aura of invincibility. But Lepanto's legacy goes beyond its immediate outcome. It was a battle steeped in symbolism, a moment where Christianity and Islam, Europe and the Middle East collided on the waves. For the Holy League, victory was a triumph of faith as much as force, celebrated across Europe as divine intervention. For the Ottomans, it was a humbling lesson in adaptability, proving even the mightiest empires must evolve or risk being left behind. And for naval historians, Lepanto stands as a bridge between eras, where the oar-powered galley of the medieval world began giving way to the sail-powered ships that would dominate the oceans for centuries to come. Why does this battle still captivate us? Because it reminds us that the sea has always been more than water. It's a mirror of human ambition, where technology, culture, and belief converge in explosive ways. Lepanto wasn't just a fight over who controlled the Mediterranean. It was a glimpse into the future, a moment when the tides of history shifted forever. And in that sense, it's as medieval as it is modern, a testament to the enduring power of the ocean as the ultimate battleground. While the Mediterranean had seen countless clashes between rival fleets, few were as consequential as the Battle of Maloria in 1284. This wasn't just a skirmish between two Italian city-states, it was a brutal showdown between Genoa and Pisa, two maritime giants whose rivalry stretched back decades. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a corporate takeover, where the prize wasn't just territory but the very lifelines of trade that fueled their wealth. By the late 13th century, control of the Mediterranean shipping lanes meant control of silk, spices, and gold flowing between Europe and the East. And for Pisa, a once dominant naval power, Maloria would become the day its empire crumbled into the sea. The battle unfolded near a tiny rocky island off the coast of Tuscany, a spot Genoa's admirals had chosen with chilling precision. Their strategy lured Pisa's fleet into shallow waters where their heavier, less maneuverable ships would flounder. As the Pisan galleys advanced, confident in their superior numbers, the Genoese sprang their trap. Rowing in tight formations, they used their agility to outflank the enemy, pinning them against the coast like a net closing around fish. The chaos that followed was a masterclass in naval warfare, ships ramming hulls, grappling hooks flying, and the screams of men drowning in the wreckage. By nightfall, Pisa had lost nearly half its fleet, along with thousands of sailors captured or slain. The defeat was so catastrophic that Pisa never fully recovered its maritime influence, its ports slowly fading into irrelevance. But the real stakes of Maloria weren't just measured in sunken ships. This battle marked a seismic shift in the balance of power. With Pisa broken, Genoa seized control of key trade routes from the Black Sea to North Africa, amassing wealth that would fund its rise as a Mediterranean superpower. The city's merchants built towering palaces along its docks, their fortunes woven from the very routes they'd won by force. Meanwhile, Pisa's decline left a vacuum in central Italy, one that Florence and other rivals rushed to fill. The ripple effects reached far beyond the sea banking networks shifted, alliances realigned, and the cultural landscape of the region transformed. What makes Maloria stand out, though, isn't just the violence or the politics, it's the way it reveals the intimate link between naval power and everyday life in the medieval world. The spices that flavored a nobleman's dinner, the silks that adorned a merchant's wife, even the loans that funded cathedrals and wars, all flowed through the channels secured by battles like this. Genoa's victory proved that in an age of sail and oar, the real rulers weren't always kings or popes, but the admirals who commanded the waves. And for Pisa, the lesson was stark. In the cutthroat world of medieval commerce, the sea giveth, and the sea taketh away. Yet there's a twist to this tale. While Genoa celebrated, its triumph sowed the seeds of future conflicts. Rivalry with Venice soon flared, setting the stage for another century of naval arms races and trade wars. Maloria wasn't an ending, it was a pivot point, proof that in the Mediterranean, no victory was ever permanent. The waves that carried one city to glory could just as easily dash another against the rocks. And that's the enduring lesson of this battle. In the medieval world, the ocean didn't just separate nations, it connected their fates for better or worse. The year 1217 found England at a crossroads, its throne contested, its nobility divided, and its very survival hanging by a thread. The First Barons' War had plunged the kingdom into chaos, with rebel lords inviting Prince Louis of France to seize the crown. As French troops marched across the countryside, it became clear that the final act of this drama wouldn't be fought on land, but on the choppy waters of the English Channel. The Battle of Sandwich wasn't just another naval skirmish, it was England's last stand, a desperate gamble to turn the tide of war with nothing but a handful of ships and a bold stroke of ingenuity. What made this clash so remarkable wasn't just the stakes, it was the sheer audacity of England's tactics. Facing a French fleet laden with reinforcements and supplies, the outnumbered English commanders did something no one expected. They turned fire into a weapon. Loading old vessels with tar, oil, and brush, they set these floating infernos adrift toward the enemy line. Picture the panic as the French sailors, trained for boarding actions and arrow volleys, suddenly found themselves dodging walls of flame in the open sea. While the fireships sowed chaos, the English closed in, their crews swinging grappling hooks like fishermen hauling in a net. What followed was a brutal melee of swords and axes, fought on decks slick with blood and seawater. But the real genius of Sandwich lay in its timing. The English didn't just attack, they struck at the precise moment the French were most vulnerable, their ships weighed down with fresh troops and horses destined for shore. Capturing these vessels didn't just mean sinking enemy ships, it meant starving Louis's army of the supplies and men it desperately needed. When the smoke cleared, England held the Channel, and with it the fate of the war. Prince Louis, stranded without reinforcements, had no choice but to negotiate his retreat. The battle's legacy stretches far beyond that single day. Sandwich proved that naval supremacy wasn't just about having the most ships, it was about using the sea itself as a tactical playground. The fireship tactic, though simple, revealed a truth that would echo through centuries of warfare. Sometimes the best defense is a clever offense. For England, the victory cemented the Channel as its moat, a natural barrier that could repel invaders if defended with courage and creativity. And for medieval admirals, it was a lesson in adaptability, showing that even the smallest fleet could outthink a larger foe. Yet perhaps Sandwich's greatest impact was psychological. In an age where kingdoms rose and fell on the strength of their swords, this battle reminded Europe that the ocean could be the ultimate arbiter of power. England's survival as an independent nation hinged not on its castles or cavalry, but on the skill of its sailors and the boldness of its commanders. That's why this clash endures in memory, not just as a turning point in a forgotten war, but as proof that in medieval Europe, the waves didn't just separate nations. They defined them. By the late 13th century, the Adriatic Sea had become a battleground where the fates of empires were decided not by kings or castles, but by the fleets of merchant republics. The Battle of Kozola in 1298 wasn't just another chapter in the endless feud between Venice and Genoa. It was a collision of two visions of Mediterranean dominance, fought with a ferocity that would leave both sides forever changed. Picture the scene: nearly 200 galleys packed into the narrow straits off the Dalmatian coast, their oars cutting through the water like knives as they closed in for what would become one of the bloodiest naval engagements of the medieval world. What set Kozola apart wasn't just the scale of the fighting, it was the sheer precision of Genoa's strategy. The Genoese Admiral Lambadoria, a seasoned veteran of these trade wars, lured the Venetian fleet into a carefully laid trap. Feigning retreat, his ships drew the overconfident Venetians into shallow waters where their larger vessels couldn't maneuver. Then, with a sudden turn, the Genoese unleashed their real weapon, a crushing flanking attack that pinned the Venetian galleys against the rocky shoreline. The result was carnage. Ships splintered under the force of rams, decks ran red with the blood of rowers and soldiers, and the Adriatic itself seemed to boil with the chaos of battle. But the most astonishing twist came after the fighting ended. Among the thousands of Venetian prisoners dragged in chains to Genoa was a name history would never forget: Marco Polo. Yes, the legendary explorer, freshly returned from his decades-long journey across Asia, found himself imprisoned not by Mongols or bandits, but by his own rivals in a trade war. It's a detail so rich with irony it feels ripped from a novel. The man who had traversed the Silk Road only to be captured on the water by the very competition that fueled his city's wealth. In his Genoa cell, Polo would dictate his travels to a fellow prisoner, giving the world the travels of Marco Polo, a book that would shape Europe's understanding of the East for centuries. The battle's aftermath revealed just how high the stakes really were. Venice, humiliated and crippled by the loss of nearly its entire fleet, faced a crisis that threatened its very survival as a maritime power. The city's merchants, once unrivaled in their dominance of Eastern trade, now scrambled to rebuild their navy and their reputation. Genoa, meanwhile, celebrated its victory with a newfound swagger, its grip on Mediterranean commerce tightening like a noose. But Kozola's true legacy wasn't just in the shifting balance of power. It was in the way it laid bare the ruthless logic of medieval naval warfare. This wasn't war for glory or territory in the traditional sense. It was war for something far more precious: control of the routes that carried silks from China, spices from India, and gold from Africa. Every sunken galley represented a fortune lost, every captured sailor a blow to a city's economic lifeline. The Venetians and Genoese understood what so many others didn't, that in their world the sea wasn't just a highway for goods, it was the beating heart of empire. And at Kozola, that heart pumped with a violence that would echo through the ages. Yet for all its brutality, the battle also hinted at something deeper, a strange symbiosis between these rival republics. Their endless clashes drove innovations in shipbuilding, navigation, and tactics, pushing medieval maritime technology to its limits. The very galleys that clashed at Kozola were masterpieces of their age, refined through decades of competition. In a way, Venice and Genoa didn't just fight each other, they made each other stronger even as they traded blows. That's the paradox of their rivalry. The same waters that divided them also bound their destinies together, a reminder that in the medieval Mediterranean, even enemies were partners in shaping the course of history. The Norse sagas speak of a land beyond the western horizon, a place of towering cliffs and endless forests where the rivers teemed with fish and the beaches glittered with strange berries. This was Vinland, the name Leif Erikson gave to North America when he became the first European to set foot there around the year 1000. But what the sagas don't often mention is that this moment of discovery was shadowed by something far darker, a violent clash that would mark the end of Viking ambitions in the New World. The Battle of Baffin Bay in 986 wasn't just a skirmish, it was the moment the medieval world's greatest seafarers met their match in the icy waters of the Arctic. The encounter began with promise. Norse explorers led by Bjarni Herjolfsson had sailed farther west than any European before them, driven by rumors of fertile land. But when they anchored in the bay's sheltered coves, they weren't alone. The Thule people, ancestors of the modern Inuit, had thrived in these frozen waters for centuries, mastering survival in a landscape that seemed unyielding to outsiders. Their kayaks, swift and silent, could navigate ice floes that would splinter a Viking longship, and their harpoons struck with deadly precision. To the Norse, who'd spent generations terrorizing coastal Europe, the Thule were unlike any opponents they'd faced, hunters who turned the sea itself into a weapon. When conflict erupted, it wasn't the pitched battle the Vikings expected. The Thule didn't row forward in formation or meet them blade to blade. Instead, they struck from the edges, their kayaks darting between ice sheets like shadows. They hurled harpoons from a distance, targeting not just warriors but the ships themselves, puncturing hulls, snapping oars, turning the Norse advantage of heavy armor into a lethal disadvantage in the freezing water. The Vikings, trained for raids on monasteries and open sea duels, found themselves outmaneuvered in a battlefield where the rules had been rewritten. The aftermath was a quiet retreat. Bjarni's surviving ships limped back to Greenland, their crews whispering of enemies who fought like ghosts upon the waves. For the Norse, Baffin Bay wasn't just a defeat, it was a revelation. The same seas that had carried them to glory in Europe became an impassable barrier in the West, not because of storms or distance, but because of people who knew the water in ways they never could. The lesson was clear: mastery of the ocean wasn't universal. It was earned through generations of intimacy with a specific patch of earth and ice. Yet the battle's true significance lies in what it represents: a fleeting moment when two medieval maritime cultures collided, each unmatched in their own domain. The Vikings, with their iconic longships, had revolutionized naval warfare, but the Thule, with their kayaks and harpoons, had perfected something just as powerful: the art of survival in the harshest waters on Earth. Their victory at Baffin Bay wasn't just a defense of territory. It was proof that the ocean could be home as much as highway, a place where tradition and innovation could defy even the boldest invaders. And so the Norse turned away, their saga shifting focus back to the familiar waters of the North Atlantic. Vinland faded from their maps, not because it wasn't rich, but because its guardians were indomitable. In that sense, Baffin Bay stands as one of history's great what-ifs, a reminder that the medieval age's greatest explorers found their limits not in the vastness of the sea, but in the strength of those who already knew its secrets. By the close of the 15th century, the Mediterranean had become a chessboard where empires moved fleets like pieces, and in 1499, the Ottomans made a move that would shake Venice to its core. The Battle of Zonschio wasn't just another clash of galleys. It was a thunderous announcement that the rules of naval warfare were changing forever. Picture the scene: the Ottoman fleet, bristling with cannons, faced off against Venice's legendary armada near the Greek coast. What unfolded wasn't just a fight for control of the waves. It was a glimpse into the future, where smoke and fire would eclipse the age of oars and boarding parties. What made Zonschio so revolutionary was the Ottomans' bold embrace of gunpowder at sea. While Venetian galleys still relied on archers and ramming tactics, their Ottoman counterparts had transformed their ships into floating artillery platforms. The deafening roar of cannons echoed across the water, their iron shot smashing through hulls with a force that rendered wooden shields and high prows obsolete. For the first time in Mediterranean warfare, firepower trumped maneuverability, and the Venetians found themselves outgunned in the very arena they dominated for centuries. Yet the battle's outcome was as much about psychology as technology. Though the engagement ended inconclusively, with storms scattering both fleets, the message was clear: Venice's invincibility at sea was a myth. The Ottomans had stood toe-to-toe with the masters of Mediterranean trade and proved they could hold their own. It was a turning point that sent shockwaves through Europe's merchant republics, proof that even the mightiest naval powers could be humbled by an empire willing to adapt. The aftermath of Zonschio rippled far beyond the Aegean. Venetian shipwrights, long the envy of the world, now scrambled to retrofit their fleets with heavier guns, while Ottoman admirals doubled down on their newfound advantage. The battle marked the beginning of the end for the classic galley, that symbol of medieval naval power, and hinted at the rise of the broadside-firing warships that would dominate the age of sail. But perhaps Zonschio's greatest legacy was its lesson in inevitability. In warfare, as in history, clinging to tradition while the world changes around you is a recipe for obsolescence. The Venetians had built an empire on the mastery of winds and currents, but the Ottomans showed that the future belonged to those who could harness the power of fire and metal. It was a brutal reminder that on the medieval ocean, as in all things, evolution was the only constant. And for Venice, the waves that had once carried its golden age would now force it to adapt or fade into the tides of history. The Strait of Gibraltar had long been a crossroads of civilizations, a narrow passage where Europe and Africa seemed close enough to touch. But in the year 1309, it became something far more, a battleground where the fate of an entire peninsula would be decided. The Battle of Gibraltar wasn't just another clash in the centuries-long Reconquista. It was the moment Castile proved that reclaiming Iberia from Muslim rule would require more than knights and castles. It would demand mastery of the sea. For centuries, the Rock of Gibraltar had stood as an impregnable fortress, its sheer cliffs defying invaders while its harbor sheltered fleets that controlled trade between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. The Muslim defenders, confident in their walls and their naval supremacy, had repelled countless Christian assaults, but Castile's King Ferdinand IV had a new strategy. Instead of hurling his forces against the cliffs, he would starve the fortress into submission. His fleet, though small, executed a blockade so tight not a single supply ship could slip through. The message was clear: this time the Christians weren't just attacking, they were suffocating Gibraltar's lifeline. What made this siege revolutionary wasn't just the blockade, but the way Castile combined land and sea power. While their ships patrolled the waters, their engineers built siege towers and catapults on shore, hammering the walls from both directions. The defenders, trapped like fish in a net, watched as their food stores dwindled and their morale cracked. After months of relentless pressure, the gates finally opened, not to a heroic charge, but to the quiet inevitability of starvation. Gibraltar fell, and with it, the balance of power in the region shifted forever. The victory's symbolism rippled far beyond the battlefield. For Iberia's Christian kingdoms, Gibraltar became a beacon of hope, proof that even the strongest Moorish strongholds could be toppled with the right strategy. For the first time, the Reconquista wasn't just a land war. It was a naval campaign where control of the waves meant control of the future. Castile's admirals, once an afterthought in a kingdom obsessed with cavalry, suddenly found themselves at the forefront of national ambition. Yet the real lesson of Gibraltar lay in its aftermath. The Castilians didn't just take the fortress, they held it, turning its docks into a base for further campaigns along the coast. This was the genius of their strategy. They understood that in medieval warfare, conquest meant nothing without consolidation. The sea wasn't just a path to victory. It was the glue that bound newly won territories to the crown. And for the next 2 centuries, Gibraltar would stand as a sentinel, watching over the strait where 2 worlds collided and where one kingdom's naval ambitions began to reshape history. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of this battle was its quiet defiance of expectations. In an age when knights and sieges dominated the chronicles, Gibraltar proved that the unsung heroes of the Reconquista might have been the sailors who kept the supply lines open and the harbors secure. Their victory whispered a truth that would echo through the ages. Sometimes the key to winning a war isn't the sword in your hand, but the ships at your back. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Indian Ocean was a world apart, a vast aquatic crossroads where Arab dhows, Gujarati merchants, and Chinese junks had traded for centuries without European interference. That all changed in 1507, when a Portuguese fleet under Afonso de Albuquerque appeared like a storm on the horizon. The Battle of the Gulf of Oman wasn't just another naval skirmish. It was a seismic shock to the established order, where medieval tactics collided with the dawn of global empire. Picture the scene: Portuguese carracks towering over the smaller regional ships, their sides studded with cannons that could strike from distances previously unimaginable in these waters. Against them stood a combined Mamluk and Gujarati fleet, masters of the monsoon winds and coastal trade routes, but utterly unprepared for what was coming. What made this clash so transformative wasn't just the weapons or the ships, it was the sheer audacity of Portugal's ambition. Albuquerque, a commander as ruthless as he was brilliant, didn't just want to win a battle, he aimed to rewrite the rules of an entire ocean. His strategy was brutally simple: use superior firepower to break enemy formations, then close in for boarding actions with heavily armored soldiers. The Mamluks and Gujaratis, accustomed to the fluid, close-quarter skirmishes of regional warfare, found themselves outmatched by the precision and discipline of European naval combat. As the Portuguese cannons roared, their shots tearing through hulls and rigging, the age-old balance of power in the Indian Ocean began to crumble. The aftermath of the battle revealed its true stakes. With their victory, the Portuguese secured not just a patch of water, but the keys to a maritime empire. The Gulf of Oman was the gateway to the spice routes of India, the pearl fisheries of Hormuz, and the silk roads that stretched to China. By controlling these choke points, Portugal could tax, divert, or block trade at will, an innovation as disruptive as any weapon. Suddenly, the wealth that had flowed freely for generations now had to pass through European hands. For local rulers, it was a wake-up call. The ocean they'd long considered their domain had become a battleground for outsiders with ambitions as vast as the sea itself. Yet the battle's legacy goes beyond conquest. It marked the moment when medieval naval traditions reliant on oars, sails, and hand-to-hand combat began yielding to the age of gunpowder and global empires. The carracks and cannons that won the day were prototypes of the ships that would dominate the oceans for centuries, tools of a new world order where control of the waves meant control of destiny. And for the peoples of the Indian Ocean, it was the opening chapter in a story of resistance and adaptation, as they grappled with a power that saw the sea not just as a highway, but as a possession. In hindsight, the Battle of the Gulf of Oman was more than a turning point, it was a warning. The medieval world's greatest strength, its interconnected trade networks, had become its vulnerability. Where goods and ideas flowed freely, so too could conquest, and as the Portuguese raised their flags over foreign harbors, they proved that in the dawning age of empire, no ocean was too distant, no coast too remote to escape the reach of those who ruled the waves. The year 1213 found Europe at a crossroads, the fragile truce between England and France crumbling into open war once more. King John of England, his reputation battered by recent defeats, faced an existential threat, a massive French fleet gathering in the port of Dam, poised to ferry an invasion force across the Channel. But what happened next wasn't the predictable clash of fleets. It was a masterclass in audacity that rewrote the playbook of medieval naval warfare. The Battle of Dam didn't just pit ships against ships, it pitted imagination against tradition, proving that sometimes the boldest move is to strike before your enemy even leaves the harbor. England's strategy was as simple as it was revolutionary. Instead of waiting to confront the French fleet at sea, Admiral William Longships led a lightning raid straight into the heart of enemy waters. Picture the scene. Under cover of dawn, Longships' squadron slipped past coastal sentries, their oars muffled, their sails darkened. The French ships, lined up like sitting ducks in the crowded harbor, never saw the attack coming. English boarding parties swarmed over the rails, torches in hand, turning the invasion fleet into a bonfire that lit up the morning sky. Within hours, over 300 French vessels, nearly the entire invasion force, were reduced to charred wreckage. The sheer speed of the assault left the French reeling, their plans in ashes before a single soldier could board a transport. What made Dam extraordinary wasn't just the scale of the destruction, it was the way it redefined naval power. For centuries, Mediterranean admirals had relied on head-to-head clashes between galleys, where numbers and muscle decided the day. But Longships demonstrated that in the stormy waters of Northern Europe, creativity could trump brute force. By choosing to attack at anchor, he negated France's superior numbers and turned their very preparedness against them. The tightly packed harbor, meant to streamline embarkation, became a death trap as flames leaped from ship to ship. It was a lesson in asymmetry, a reminder that the strongest fleet in the world means nothing if it never gets the chance to sail. The aftermath rippled far beyond the smoldering docks of Dam. King Philip Augustus of France, his invasion plans in ruins, was forced to delay his campaign for years, buying England crucial time to regroup. More importantly, the battle planted a seed in European naval thinking, the idea that preemption could be as decisive as pitched combat. Future commanders, from the Spanish Armada to the British Royal Navy, would study Dam as proof that sometimes the best defense is a perfectly timed offense. Yet the battle's true legacy lies in its defiance of convention. In an age when chivalry dictated that wars should be fought face to face, Longships' raid was seen by some as dishonorable, a strike against unprepared foes. But history judges differently. Dam wasn't just a raid, it was the moment medieval naval warfare grew up, shedding outdated notions of fairness in favor of cold, calculated efficiency. The lesson was clear. In the struggle for control of the waves, victory doesn't always go to the strongest fleet, but to the commander who dares to rewrite the rules. And so the ashes of Dam carried a message that would echo through the centuries. The ocean rewards not just courage but cunning. For England, it was a fleeting triumph in a troubled reign, but for naval strategists it became something far more enduring. A blueprint, a warning, proof that in the right hands, even the smallest flame could burn an empire's ambitions to the waterline. The waters around Sicily had always been contested, but in 1266, they became the stage for a battle that would decide the fate of kingdoms. The Battle of the Lipari Islands wasn't just another skirmish in the endless Angevin-Aragonese rivalry. It was a defining moment where naval supremacy translated directly into political dominance. At stake was nothing less than control of Sicily, the wealthy Mediterranean crossroads whose ports fed the treasuries of empires. And for Charles of Anjou, the ambitious French prince determined to carve out his own kingdom in southern Italy, victory at Lipari would prove that sea power could be the ultimate trump card in medieval geopolitics. What made this clash so pivotal was the sheer asymmetry of the forces involved. The Aragonese fleet, commanded by the seasoned Admiral Roger of Loria, was outnumbered nearly 2-1 by the Angevin armada. Conventional wisdom dictated that numbers decided naval battles, but Loria had spent years studying the currents and winds of the Sicilian Straits. He knew the Lipari Islands, a volcanic archipelago north of Sicily, could be more than just a backdrop, they could be weapons. Luring the Angevin fleet into the narrow channels between the islands, Loria's ships darted in and out of hidden coves, using the jagged coastline to fragment the enemy formation. The Angevins, trained for open water engagements, found their numerical advantage useless in waters where only a handful of ships could engage at a time. The battle's aftermath revealed its true significance. With the Angevin fleet shattered, Charles of Anjou's dreams of uncontested rule over Sicily evaporated overnight. The Aragonese, once seen as underdogs, now held the keys to the central Mediterranean. Trade routes that had fed Angevin coffers were suddenly up for grabs, and coastal cities that had pledged loyalty to Charles began reconsidering their allegiances. The lesson was clear. In the medieval world, a single naval victory could unravel years of political maneuvering. Yet Lipari's legacy wasn't just about who won or lost, it was about how they won. Loria's tactics marked a shift in naval warfare, proving that terrain could be as decisive as firepower or numbers. Future admirals would study his use of the islands as natural fortresses, a strategy that blurred the line between land and sea combat. And for Sicily, the battle became a turning point in its long history as a prize fought over by empires. The Aragonese victory didn't just change rulers, it reshaped the island's identity, tying its fate to the Iberian Peninsula for centuries to come. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of Lipari lies in its reminder that the Mediterranean was never just water. It was a chessboard where kingdoms rose and fell on the strength of their fleets. For Charles of Anjou, the battle was a humbling lesson in humility. For Roger of Loria, it was proof that genius could triumph over brute force. And for us, it's a window into an age where the sea wasn't just a barrier between nations, but the very arena where their destinies were decided. The waters off England's southern coast had seen their share of raids and skirmishes, but in August 1350, they became the setting for one of the most audacious naval gambles of the medieval age. The Battle of Winchelsea, known to history as Les Espagnols-sur-Mer, wasn't just a clash between kingdoms, it was a collision of two visions of maritime power. On one side, King Edward Roman III of England, fresh from his triumphs at Crecy, now turned his ambitions seaward. On the other, a mighty Castilian fleet, its holds brimming with Flemish wool and Gascon wine, sailing home under the protection of ships crewed by men who'd honed their skills battling Muslim corsairs in the Strait of Gibraltar. This was no chance encounter. It was a deliberate interception, a king staking his reputation on the belief that England could dominate the waves as thoroughly as it had the fields of France. What made Winchelsea extraordinary wasn't just the outcome, it was the sheer improvisation of the English tactics. Edward's fleet, though outnumbered, exploited the one advantage their smaller ships possessed: maneuverability. As the towering Castilian carracks bore down on them, the English vessels darted between their opponents like terriers harrying bulls, their archers raining arrows onto the enemy decks before closing in for brutal boarding actions. The battle devolved into a dozen swirling melees, ships locked together by grappling hooks as men fought hand-to-hand across decks slick with blood and seawater. But the real turning point came when Edward's own ship, the Cog Thomas, found itself rammed and taking on water. Lesser commanders might have panicked, but the king ordered his crew to lash their vessel to a nearby Castilian ship, turning disaster into opportunity. By nightfall, the channel was littered with wreckage, and the surviving Castilian ships fled for open water. Yet Winchelsea's significance goes beyond the immediate victory. This battle laid bare the thin line between commerce and combat in medieval Europe. The Castilian ships weren't a formal war fleet. They were merchant vessels escorted by armed guards, a common practice in an era when every trader doubled as a potential raider. Edward's attack, though sanctioned by the ongoing hostilities between England and Castile, blurred the boundaries between state-sponsored warfare and outright piracy. For the English crown, the captured cargoes represented a windfall. For the Castilian merchants, it was a stark reminder that the sea offered no safety without the protection of royal navies. The aftermath reshaped perceptions of England's naval capabilities. Where once the kingdom had relied on hired Genoese crossbowmen and Flemish transports, now it had proven it could project power independently at sea. Winchelsea became a cornerstone of English maritime identity, a precedent that would echo through the ages as later monarchs built upon Edward's legacy. But perhaps the battle's most enduring lesson was its demonstration of adaptability. The way a king more famed for his longbowmen could pivot to naval command, proving that in medieval warfare, the greatest weapon wasn't any ship or sword, but the willingness to meet the enemy on whatever ground or water they chose. For Castile, the defeat was a humbling setback, but one that spurred innovation. Within decades, their shipwrights would be perfecting the caravel, a vessel combining Northern European hull design with Mediterranean lateen sails, the very ships that would one day carry explorers to the New World. In that sense, Winchelsea wasn't just an ending, but a beginning. The moment two maritime traditions clashed, learned from each other, and set sail toward futures neither could yet imagine. By the winter of 1380, Venice stood on the brink of collapse. The War of Kyogia had pushed the Maritime Republic to its limits. Genoese forces occupied the lagoon city of Kyogia itself, just 25 miles from Venice's iconic canals, while enemy ships strangled the trade routes that fed its wealth. For the first time in centuries, the Lion of St. Mark seemed poised to fall. But what happened next wasn't just a battle. It was a masterstroke of desperation and genius, a comeback that would redefine Venetian resilience. The Battle of Kyogia didn't just decide a war. It revealed how a city with its back against the waves could turn the sea itself into a weapon. The turning point came when Venetian Admiral Vittorio Pisani, recently released from prison in a moment of civic panic, took command of the remnants of his city's fleet. His strategy was as daring as it was unorthodox. Instead of charging headlong into Geno's strength, Pisani played the long game. He ordered his ships to blockade Kyogia from the sea, cutting off the occupying forces from reinforcements and supplies. Meanwhile, Venetian engineers performed a feat that bordered on alchemy. They sank barges laden with stones to block the harbor's channels, transforming the watery battlefield into a maze of submerged obstacles. The Genoese, trapped like fish in a net, watched helplessly as their supply lines withered and their morale frayed. But the true brilliance of Venice's strategy lay in its patience. For months, the blockade tightened like a noose, with Pisani refusing to engage in the pitched battles the Genoese craved. Instead, his galleys harried enemy supply ships, while Venetian sappers on land tunneled beneath Kyogia's walls. The Genoese, accustomed to the quick strikes of Mediterranean naval warfare, found themselves mired in a war of attrition they couldn't win. By the time Pisani finally ordered the assault, his enemies were starving, exhausted, and ripe for defeat. The recapture of Kyogia wasn't just a victory, it was a humiliation, proof that Venice could outthink as well as outfight its rivals. The aftermath reshaped the Adriatic's balance of power. Genoa, its fleet shattered and its treasury drained, never again posed a serious threat to Venetian dominance. the battle cemented Venice's reputation as the undisputed mistress of the northern Mediterranean, its control over trade routes from the Levant to the Alps now unchallenged. But Kyogia's legacy wasn't just political, it was psychological. The Venetians had stared into the abyss and emerged not just intact, but stronger. Their triumph became a legend, a story told in waterfront taverns and merchant halls for generations. How a city built on water had nearly drowned, only to rise again through sheer cunning and will. What makes this battle unforgettable, though, isn't just the tactics or the outcome, it's what it reveals about the medieval world's most unconventional superpower. Venice wasn't an empire of farmland or castles. Its strength flowed from the sea and the minds of those who knew how to wield it. At Kyogia, the Venetians didn't just fight a battle, they fought like only Venetians could, turning the lagoon's tides, channels, and even its silence into instruments of victory. And in doing so, they proved that in the medieval Mediterranean, the sharpest weapon wasn't always a sword sometimes. It was simply knowing the water better than your enemy. The waters of the Strait of Messina had always been a bottleneck of empires, where the tides of history flowed swift and unpredictable. In the year 965, this narrow passage between Sicily and Italy became the stage for a clash that encapsulated an entire era's worth of tension. The Battle of the Straits of Messina wasn't just another skirmish. It was a flashpoint in the centuries-long struggle between the Byzantine Empire and the rising Muslim powers of the Mediterranean, a fight for control of the sea lanes that fed empires. What made this battle so pivotal was the sheer strategic weight of the strait itself. Picture it as the Mediterranean's hourglass. Whoever held Messina controlled the flow of trade, troops, and influence between the eastern and western halves of the sea. The Byzantines, heirs to Rome's naval traditions, understood this better than anyone. Their fleet, though stretched thin by years of conflict, was still a formidable force of dromons, sleek, oared warships armed with Greek fire, that terrifying incendiary weapon that could turn enemy vessels into floating pyres. But their opponents, the Fatimid Caliphate's Arab fleets, were no strangers to naval warfare either. Having honed their skills in raids and coastal campaigns, they brought speed, adaptability, and a hunger to expand their grip on the Mediterranean's richest trade routes. When the two forces met near Messina's rocky shores, the battle unfolded like a deadly dance. The Byzantines, leveraging their knowledge of local currents, tried to funnel the Arab ships into tight formations where their Greek fire could wreak maximum havoc. But the Fatimid captains, masters of hit-and-run tactics, refused to play by Byzantine rules. Their lighter galleys darted in and out of range, peppering the heavier dromons with arrows before retreating like shadows. The turning point came when a shift in wind direction, one of those unpredictable Mediterranean gusts, carried the flames of Greek fire back toward the Byzantine line, forcing them to break formation. Seizing the moment, the Arab fleet surged forward, their boarding parties overwhelming disorganized crews in a frenzy of scimitars and shields. The aftermath reverberated far beyond the strait. With Messina secured, the Fatimids tightened their grip on Sicily, accelerating the island's transformation into a multicultural hub where Arab, Greek, and Latin influences intertwined. For the Byzantines, the defeat was a wake-up call, proof that even their vaunted naval technology couldn't compensate for stretched resources and complacent tactics. But the battle's true significance lay in what it symbolized. The Mediterranean was no longer a Christian lake. The Arabs had arrived not as raiders, but as rivals capable of standing toe-to-toe with empires. Yet the story of Messina isn't just one of conflict, it's also a tale of unintended consequences. The Fatimid victory didn't lead to outright domination, but to an uneasy equilibrium. Trade continued, cultures mixed, and the Strait remained a crossroads where worlds collided and blended. In that sense, the battle was less an ending than a pivot, a moment when the medieval Mediterranean's future became as fluid as the waters themselves. And for those who study these waves today, it's a reminder that history's greatest battles aren't always the bloodiest sometimes. They're the ones that quietly reshape the map of possibility. By the early 15th century, the narrow waters of the Orson Strait had become more than just a passage between Denmark and Sweden. They were the lifeblood of Northern Europe's wealth. The Battle of the Orson in 1427 wasn't fought over crowns or conquest, but over something far more tangible: the right to tax every barrel of herring, every bale of wool, and every ingot of iron that sailed through these choppy waters. On one side stood King Erik of Denmark, determined to break the stranglehold of the Hanseatic League, the powerful network of merchant cities that had turned the Baltic into its private trading empire. On the other, the Hanseatic fleet, a force of seasoned sailors and merchants who understood that their ships weren't just vessels. They were floating vaults guarding the prosperity of an entire economic order. What made this clash so revealing was how openly it laid bare the priorities of medieval naval warfare. The Hanseatic captains weren't nobles seeking glory. They were pragmatists defending a system that had made their cities rich. Their ships, though outnumbered, were crewed by men who knew these waters like their own harbor fronts, their maneuvers honed by decades of escorting cargo through pirate-infested straits. When the Danish fleet closed in, expecting a traditional melee, the Hanseatic admirals did something unexpected. They fought like accountants with swords. Instead of reckless charges, they formed disciplined lines, using their superior knowledge of local currents to control the engagement's pace. Their goal wasn't annihilation, but attrition, to bleed the Danish fleet just enough to prove that challenging their trade privileges would always cost more than it was worth. The aftermath of Orson rippled through ledgers as much as battle chronicles. With their victory, the Hanseatic League didn't just preserve its monopolies, it sent a message to every king and duke eyeing its coffers. The Baltic would remain a merchant sea where business trumped brute force. For Denmark, the defeat was a bitter lesson in realpolitik. Even royal navies couldn't easily dismantle an alliance built on silver and self-interest. And for historians, the battle became a case study in how medieval economies waged war. The cannons and grappling hooks were just tools. The real weapons were contracts, tariffs, and the unshakable belief that profit margins could be worth dying for. Yet the battle's true legacy lies in its modern echoes. The Hanseatic League's model, a coalition of cities leveraging collective naval power to protect trade, foreshadowed everything from the Dutch East India Company to modern shipping cartels. Orson proved that in the right hands, a fleet could be more than an instrument of conquest. It could be the enforcer of an economic vision. And for the merchants of Lübeck, Hamburg, and Danzig, that vision was clear. The waves weren't just routes to wealth, they were the walls of their empire. A lesson written not in blood, but in ink and coin, and one that would shape the destiny of Northern Europe for centuries to come. The summer of 1545 should have been a triumph for Henry VIII. His navy, the pride of England, lay anchored in the Solent, a shimmering display of Tudor power meant to repel a French invasion fleet. Among the assembled ships, none drew the eye like the Merry Rose, a floating fortress that had served the crown for 34 years. She was a relic of a passing age, her design straddling the medieval world of clinker-built hulls and the dawning era of broadside cannons. And on July 19th, as she turned to engage the enemy, the sea claimed her in a disaster that would echo through naval history. The Battle of the Solent wasn't just a skirmish, it was a wake-up call, a moment when the ocean exposed the deadly cost of clinging to tradition in a world racing toward change. What made the Mary Rose's sinking so emblematic was the very thing that had once made her revolutionary, her hybrid design. Built in 1512 as one of England's first carracks, she'd been retrofitted with gun ports to accommodate the new artillery-centric warfare. But those modifications came at a price. Eyewitnesses reported that as she heeled into a sharp turn, water surged through her lower gun ports, open to vent the smoke of her recent broadside. In an instant, the sea poured in, dragging the ship and nearly 500 men to the bottom. The tragedy wasn't just bad luck, it was a flaw in the ship's very bones. The Mary Rose had been built for an age of archers and boarding parties, not the thunderous recoil of heavy guns. Her sinking laid bare the perils of halfway measures in an era of technological upheaval. Yet the battle itself was a paradox. While the Mary Rose's loss symbolized the end of medieval naval traditions, the larger engagement hinted at the future. The French fleet, though superior in numbers, found itself stymied by England's coastal defenses and the unpredictable Solent tides. This wasn't the open water clashes of the past, where ships dueled like floating castles. It was a tentative dance of long-range gunnery and strategic positioning, a preview of the standoff battles that would dominate the age of sail. Henry's navy, for all its misfires, was groping toward a new doctrine, one where firepower trumped melee combat and where ships would evolve from platforms for soldiers into weapons in their own right. The aftermath of Solent reverberated far beyond the wreckage. For England, the loss of the Mary Rose became a cautionary tale, spurring innovations in ship design that would culminate in the sleek, gun-heavy galleons of Elizabeth's reign. For historians, the battle marks the blurry boundary between medieval and modern warfare, a moment when the old ways literally capsized under the weight of progress. And for archaeologists, the Mary Rose's rediscovery in the 20th century offered an unparalleled window into both worlds. Her preserved hull, with its mix of longbows and early cannons, stands as a silent testament to an era caught between two ages. But perhaps the deepest lesson of Solent lies in its reminder that technological revolutions are rarely clean breaks. The medieval ocean didn't vanish overnight. It faded, sometimes tragically, as the tides of change rolled in. The Mary Rose wasn't just a ship, she was a mirror, reflecting the struggles of every society forced to navigate the treacherous waters between what was and what must be. And in that sense, her story isn't confined to 1545. It's a timeless warning. On the sea of progress, even the mightiest vessels can founder if they fail to read the winds. The waters off the tiny island of Ponsa might seem an unlikely stage for a battle that reshaped Mediterranean history, but in 1435, this speck of land between Rome and Naples became the crucible where Aragon's naval ambitions were forged into reality. The Battle of Ponsa wasn't just another skirmish in the endless rivalry between Mediterranean powers. It was a masterclass in how alliances could turn the tide of war, proving that even the mightiest fleets could fall to well-coordinated strategy. On one side stood Alfonso V of Aragon, a king whose dreams of a Mediterranean empire hinged on breaking Genoa's grip on the sea. On the other, the Genoese fleet, proud heirs to a maritime tradition that had dominated trade routes for centuries. What unfolded was less a battle than a trap sprung with surgical precision. Alfonso's secret weapon wasn't just his ships, it was his diplomacy. Months before the clash, he'd secured the allegiance of the Duke of Milan, a move that gave him access to Milanese ports and intelligence networks. When the Genoese fleet, led by their Doge Tommaso Campofregoso, sailed south to intercept Aragonese reinforcements, they expected a straightforward engagement. Instead, they found themselves ambushed by a combined Aragonese-Milanese force that had been lying in wait. the Genos, caught between Ponsa's rocky coastline and Alfonso's advancing galleys, had no room to maneuver. Their ships, packed too closely together, became easy targets for Aragonese boarding parties, while Milanese archers rained fire from the flanks. Within hours, the pride of Genoa's navy, along with its doge, was in chains. The aftermath of Ponsa sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean. For Aragon, the victory was a gateway. With Genoa's fleet neutralized, Alfonso tightened his grip on Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia, stitching together a maritime empire that stretched from Spain to Italy. The battle proved that naval supremacy wasn't just about having the most ships, it was about knowing when and where to strike, and whose loyalty could be bought or bargained for. For Genoa, the humiliation was existential. The loss of their fleet crippled their ability to project power, accelerating their decline as a standalone naval force. Within decades, the city would become a pawn in the struggles between France and Milan, its gloried days as a maritime republic fading into memory. Yet Ponsa's true legacy lies in its lesson about the fluidity of medieval naval warfare. This wasn't a clash of monolithic empires but of shifting coalitions, where today's rival could be tomorrow's ally. Alfonso's success hinged on recognizing that the sea, for all its vastness, was a network, a web of ports, friendships, and grudges that could be navigated as skillfully as any coastline. In that sense, Ponsa wasn't just a battle. It was a blueprint for how to win a war without firing a single shot, by ensuring your enemy never even reached the battlefield. And for the Mediterranean's rising powers, it was a reminder that the waves rewarded not just courage but cunning. Norway's fjords had seen their share of bloodshed, but in the summer of 1184, the waters of the Sognefjord turned crimson in a battle that would decide the fate of a kingdom. The Battle of Fimrate wasn't just another clash in Norway's bitter civil wars. It was the moment King Sverre Sigurdsson proved that control of the waves could crush rebellions as decisively as any land campaign. The rival Birkebeiner faction, though fierce on land, found themselves outmaneuvered in the narrow fjord where Sverre's smaller, nimbler ships turned geography into a weapon. Picture the scene: towering cliffs funneling the Birkebeiner fleet into a death trap, their heavier vessels struggling to pivot as Sverre's forces rained arrows and stones from all sides. By nightfall, the fjord was choked with wreckage, and Norway's destiny had been rewritten on the water. What made Fimrate so revolutionary wasn't just the outcome, it was the way it exposed the fragility of power in a fractured kingdom. Medieval naval battles typically pitted nation against nation, but here, the sea became the stage for a domestic reckoning. Sverre, a former priest turned warlord, understood something his rivals overlooked. In a land of fjords and coastlines, the faction that ruled the waves controlled supply lines, communication, and the very rhythm of war. His victory didn't just eliminate the Birkebeiner leadership. It severed the rebellion's lifelines, leaving scattered pockets of resistance to wither without reinforcements or escape routes. The lesson was stark: civil wars could be won or lost at sea long before the final sword was swung on land. Yet Fimrate's legacy goes beyond tactics. The battle marked the climax of Norway's long, chaotic period of civil strife, paving the way for Sverre to consolidate his rule and reshape the kingdom's identity. His triumph proved that naval innovation wasn't just for empires facing external threat. It was equally vital for rulers grappling with internal dissent. The ships that secured his victory weren't just vessels of war, they were instruments of unity, binding a fractured realm together by force of oar and sail. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of Fimrate lies in its reminder that the sea doesn't distinguish between foreign invaders and homegrown rivals. To the water, all fleets are equal, and the admiral who masters its rhythms holds the key to more than battles. he holds the key to the future itself. For Norway, that future would be written not in the halls of kings, but on the decks of the ships that finally brought its civil wars to an end. The waters off Modon in the summer of 1500 weren't just another patch of the Mediterranean, they were the proving ground for an empire on the rise. The Battle of Modon wasn't merely a defeat for Venice, it was a declaration, a moment when the Ottomans stepped onto the naval stage with a confidence that would reshape the sea's balance of power for centuries. Sultan Bayezid II's fleet, once seen as a secondary threat to Venice's maritime dominance, arrived with a precision that stunned European observers. Their ships moved not as a loose collection of galleys, but as a single weapon, each vessel positioned to exploit weaknesses, each maneuver calculated to maximize chaos. For the Venetians, who had spent generations dictating terms in these waters, the shock wasn't just losing a battle, it was realizing they were no longer the masters of the game they'd invented. What made Modon so transformative was the Ottomans' mastery of combined arms, a blend of firepower, discipline, and adaptability that rendered Venetian tactics obsolete. Where Venice relied on the tried and true methods of ramming and boarding, the Ottomans integrated their naval forces with land-based artillery, creating deadly crossfires that pinned enemy ships in killing zones. Their rowers, often dismissed as mere muscle by European admirals, were trained to execute complex maneuvers under fire, turning what should have been a close-quarters brawl into a showcase of orchestrated destruction. The Venetians, accustomed to outmaneuvering less disciplined foes, found themselves outthought at every turn, their formations splintered by an enemy that fought like a single organism. The aftermath of Modon reverberated far beyond the shattered hulls left bobbing in the Ionian Sea. For Venice, the loss was existential. Modon had been more than a strategic outpost. It was a symbol of La Serenissimi's reach, a link in the chain of ports that secured its trade routes to the Levant. Its fall, coupled with the destruction of the fleet sent to relieve it, left the Republic's eastern flank exposed and its confidence shaken. For the Ottomans, the victory was a blueprint. Modon proved their naval ambitions weren't just aspirational, they were achievable, and with terrifying speed. The battle became a cornerstone of their maritime doctrine, a lesson in how to leverage coordination and firepower against opponents clinging to outdated traditions. Yet Modon's true significance lies in what it foreshadowed. This wasn't just the end of Venetian supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean, it was the birth of a new era in naval warfare. The Ottoman success hinted at the future of combat at sea, a future where formations mattered as much as brute strength, where logistics and discipline could trump sheer numbers. In that sense, Modon was both a finale and an overture, the last gasp of medieval naval warfare's old guard and the first breath of something far more modern. And for the empires watching from the sidelines, it was a warning. The ocean's rules were changing, and only those willing to adapt would survive the storm. These 20 battles paint the medieval ocean not as empty space between lands, but as history's most contested arena, a liquid chessboard where kingdoms gambled their futures on the roll of the waves. Think of each clash we've explored not as isolated events, but as turning points in a grander story. Viking longships proving mobility could trump numbers, Venetian fire galleys showcasing how trade routes doubled as battle lines, and the Ottomans rewriting naval playbooks with cannons that turned ships into floating fortresses. What unites them all is the realization that water was never just territory to cross, it was power to seize, a truth as relevant to medieval admirals as it is to modern strategists. The deeper legacy lies in how these battles shaped the world beyond the shoreline. When Genoa shattered Pisa's fleet at Maloria, it wasn't just ships that sank, it was an entire economic order, with Tuscan merchants yielding control of the Mediterranean spice trade to their rivals. England's victory at Sluys didn't merely repel France, it birthed a naval doctrine that would one day underpin the British Empire. Even defeats carried unexpected consequences. The Norse retreat from Baffin Bay preserved indigenous maritime traditions that had thrived for centuries, while the Mary Rose's tragic sinking became a catalyst for warship evolution. These weren't just fights, they were hinges upon which history swung. Yet the most striking lesson is how fluid medieval warfare truly was. Unlike static land battles, naval combat forced commanders to reckon with currents, winds, and tides, elements no army could control. The admirals who thrived, from Roger of Loria to Vittorio Pisani, were those who treated the sea as an ally rather than an obstacle. Their innovations, fireships at Dam, blockade tactics at Kyogia, even Marco Polo's accidental imprisonment after Kozola reveal a world where adaptability trumped tradition. The ocean rewarded creativity as much as courage, a principle that still guides navies today. So why does this matter now? Because the medieval sea's echoes linger in every modern conflict over trade lanes, piracy, or territorial waters. When nations deploy coast guards to contested islands or protect oil tankers in narrow straits, they're playing by rules written centuries ago. The stakes have globalized, but the fundamentals remain. Control the waves, and you control the world's wealth, security, and connections. That's the enduring power of these stories. They remind us that the past isn't just about what happened, but about why it still resonates. Now we turn to you. Which of these battles left the strongest impression? Was it the Viking duel at Svolder, where a king's fate hung on ship design? Or perhaps Lepanto's fiery chaos, signaling the end of an era? Drop your thoughts below, and if you've enjoyed this voyage through history's most epic naval clashes, be sure to hit subscribe. The past is full of untold sagas waiting to surface, and we're just getting started. Until next time, fair winds and following seas.